Hey guys, Jenn Bruno Smith here with the High Rollers Club. I'm here with Rachel Brenke from TheLawTog. How are you?
Good. How are you? I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here with us. You've been in the industry and around for so long, giving great advice. So it's so exciting to have you here. So tell me how you kind of got started and where your beginnings were. Did you go to law school? Did you?
Yeah, so the backstory is I never really fit, much like many of you listening, I never really fit into like the 9 to 5, into a box, into a cubicle. And so I always knew I wanted to work for myself. And so I dabbled through different entrepreneurship things, graphic design at one point, online apparel store, and moved into kind of business research strategy type stuff. And then I decided I want to go to law school. And while I was in law school was actually when I started taking my skills of photography and doing it full time for money and a creative outlet and all of that. So I was running my business all through law school. And then by the time that I came out the other side, I realized there was such a need for photographers on a lot of the copyright contracts and issues that are out there. And there really wasn't like one specific photography resource that people could find the information. There was a lot of like halfway information or wrong information on the internet. So I created TheLawTog, and here we are.
I love that. I love that. So did you shoot too? Were you a photographer as well?
I started out, doing everything like everyone does, I think, for money in the beginning, kind of try to move into weddings, but that didn't really fit my schedule or in really the people that I wanted to reach. And so I moved from there into more commercial-based photography and a lot of women-based photography. So boudoir, headshots, and that kind of stuff. It was a nice crossover because a lot of my commercial clients are professional women. And so I could get them on the headshot side and then also for the boudoir side.
Right. So do you still shoot, or are you only doing law and how it relates to photography?
It depends on what month you ask me, because there's busier seasons than others. The law firm is extremely busy with a lot of copyright infringement issues. And so that's been taking up a lot of my time, but I still have my business consulting business where I also provide photography. So it's a lot of marketing based photography. And like I said, it just depends on the month, which one I'm doing more of.
Right. So do you have a lot of photography clients that are going through like copyright infringement things, the cases that you work with them on? Is that kind of what you mean?
That's the number one thing that our law firm ends up working on. Since we went through TheLawTog, we have reached it for a lot of you guys, providing the free resources there. Copyright is, I would say, the number one problem that many of you are facing right now in contracts is like super close behind.
Right.
We could put them even, but I just feel like copyright is such a huge issue right now. And as far as when it comes to infringement, just because so many businesses, not photography necessarily, but so many other businesses don't understand copyright law. So they're snagging y'all's work, they're using it, then they're not wanting to pay for it. And so we see a lot of copyright infringement stuff. And what's really interesting about it is it's not even other small businesses that are doing it. It's people like huge multi-billion international corporations that are infringing. And so that's definitely the landscape of what you photographers are facing. And so we try to provide a lot of those resources at TheLawTog too. And also obviously highlighting it here. So if you don't know anything about copyright, you need to go learn about what your rights are, then what to do when somebody infringes, because it's not if, it's going to be when.
Right. So we have listeners on all, in all parts of their journey, like those that are just beginning, those kind of in the middle, very, masters of their craft. We have lots of different listeners. So for the people that are just starting out, how would you define, how would you explain copyright? How do they know that something is being infringed upon versus just because a lot of beginning photographers, if a big corporation took their stuff, they would be like, this is really cool.
Cool. Yeah.
I'm on one of those there's card websites, you know what I mean? And they'll snag your work and they'll put it on Christmas cards. And in the beginning, I remember that happened to me a few times. And I was like, this is really cool. This looks took my work. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, wait a minute, this website took my work. So how do you, how would you kind of explain that to someone who's a layperson and might not know the difference?
So copyright is the ownership. It's who owns the photograph that you're creating. And I'm speaking from a place that I'm assuming the majority of people listening are solo or small photography business owners. So you're probably the owner and the photographer as well. And so either you or your entity is going to own the photograph. If you work for somebody else, it's like an employee, that employee owns it. And what that means is when you own intellectual property, in this case, it's going to be a photograph, you have a bunch of rights. You have the right to display it, to reproduce it, to get paid for the display, reproduction, alteration, licensing, all that sort of stuff. And so you have full control over what happens to that photograph to prevent people from using it commercially. So for example, we just went up against a really large hotel chain multiple times actually for different clients because we found many different infringements, and they had just snagged the photos off of Instagram and stuck it on their Facebook and were running it through ads. Well, that's commercial based. They were advertising their hotel, and they were also putting it into an advertisement to solicit people to book their hotel. That's commercial. They didn't have permission from the photographers. So the photographers, they have the copyright, they're the owners, then get to pursue this infringement against the hotel for loss of money, for the fact that they the hotel didn't have permission. They had no permissions to use these photographs. They had no ownership. They had no license. They had no permission, no nothing from the photographer. And so the photographer could then pursue them for payment, and it's typically equal to what a commercial license would be.
Right. So I guess for Boudoir, because I shoot Boudoir full time, now what happens sometimes for me is my clients will take their images and put them on Instagram, and then they tag the designer of the lingerie, and then the lingerie picks up the image. So in a case like that, is it still considered copyright infringement if they are pulling from the client's website or the client's feed?
Yep. Always, and actually the situation you just outlined is a very classic one. There's two major classic ways this happens. It's not typically like hotel chain employee goes out and finds the photograph. It does happen, but typically scenario number one is they have like a third-party marketing agency that does it for them. Or in your case, especially we see this a lot with wedding photographers and boudoir, it's the client that's either tagged the company or given it to the venue or given it to the dress designer. And the number one question you have to ask yourself is the person using it, do they have permission? So obviously it's stuck on that lingerie designer's Instagram, and they're trying to obviously sell their lingerie, they are infringing. You could even take a step further to say that if your client gave the permission to the lingerie designer, they're also infringing. I don't typically recommend that my photography clients, the photographers that I represent, I don't typically recommend that you pursue your client in a situation like that. Typically just pursue the end user. So in that case, it'd be the lingerie designer. I just feel like sometimes, I don't know, you don't want to sully that relationship. Clients weren't the ones that were using it for commercial gain. They didn't, even though they didn't have permission, they were probably just excited. Right. And there even may be an element that you didn't educate them that they couldn't get permission. So I have never, I think, advised going after your photography client under those circumstances. But definitely if it's like a lingerie designer or like a wedding venue or something, they didn't have permission from you, the owner. It doesn't matter if they had permission from the client or like if you're a wedding, like from a wedding planner or anything like that. It needs to be whoever the copyright owner is, and that's typically you, the photographer.
Right, right. So, another situation like that we run into a lot as photographers is not only like images being stolen or infringed upon, I guess, but also the copy from like our website and blogs and things like that. So, I recently had a situation where the copy from my entire website was taken off, right? And they literally just copied and pasted it and put it on their website. And so I did what any person in the 2020 would do. You go on LegalZoom and you copy a cease and desist, right, and send it out. How like, are those things okay? Or should you hire legal counsel? Like usually just, I sent that out and it was, down in like a minute, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if anything, it was a fear tactic, but how, I guess, how strong is a document like that you pull off Zoom versus hiring an attorney to address it for you?
Well, I don't recommend legal Zoom for multiple reasons. It would be a whole thing for us to talk about, but namely, it's not specific to photography. So you're going to get something like that and you can get a cease and desist. And I haven't looked at those recently to see exactly the contents of it, but you're not going to get support like you would from an attorney. And I also don't believe it's obviously not drafted specifically for photographers. So like on the TheLawTog, we have form templates and stuff like that are written specifically for photographers that you can be used. However, that being said, I'm the first to say, even though I run the TheLawTog and we have contract template forms ranging from cease and desist to print release, model release, services contracts, nothing replaces the value that you can get from an attorney. However, it needs to be a good attorney that understands the photography industry. And so that can be very difficult. And that's kind of where what the TheLawTog's mission is. One of the things we noticed, besides the fact that there wasn't a website out there for photographers with information specifically for them, we have that in the blog and the videos and podcasts and stuff. We also noticed that a lot of photographers were running into issues when they went to lawyers. Many lawyers have never run a business before. If they've run a business, it's been a legal business more than likely, and they've definitely never run a photography business owner or photographer.
Right.
And so they're not understanding the pushback you're going to get from clients, the questions you're going to get, what it means to be you, etc. So I think that if you can find a good attorney to write you a contract, that's good. But we saw that this was missing. A lot of photographers were leaving lawyers' offices and their contracts were fine. They were protective, but they weren't doing some of the other things that contracts can do, which I'll mention here in a second. So what we did with the TheLawTog, we have contract template forms and we recommend, download, use those. You can take that to an attorney to fine tune for your state since they're not drafted by state. But that way you're getting the full well-rounded view of what photographers specifically need. And then you're also getting a relationship with an attorney, getting it fine tuned for your state. And that way you're set up that way. So it's not an either or. If you can find an attorney that's well-versed in the photography industry, fantastic. I don't know many of them. I can name like 3 of them and I'm one. So now it doesn't mean they're not out there. It just means they're not making themselves very prominently known. I will tell you though, one thing I want to really say about contracts, and contracts, as I mentioned earlier, kind of with the copyright stuff, when we were saying about the client giving permission they didn't have, and I mentioned that the client may not have been well educated. Contracts educate your client, ranging from copyright to what the responsibilities are, how much they owe you, when they owe you. And it's also letting the client know what you, the photographer, are going to do. And so contracts are way more than just a legal tool. They're also expectation setting tool, and they're also going to help clear up miscommunications, because really, majority of the times that a legal issue happens, when you guys end up coming to me because you have a problem, it's not because you've necessarily done something horribly bad or your client's done something horribly bad. I know we see those stories, especially in the TheLawTog Facebook group and other groups online, because that's what people share, right? That's sensational.
Right.
The majority of issues I see are actually a result of breakdown in communication, and it's stuff that can be solidified into a contract. And so it's in one central place that both you and the client are agreeing to, that you've had drafted by hopefully an attorney that understands the photography industry, that understands intellectual property, which is a whole nother thing, because just because you're a lawyer, it's my little rant, just because they're a lawyer doesn't mean they understand intellectual property. And
Right.
Intellectual property is the umbrella that covers website text, like you're talking about, photographs, video, and all of that stuff. So just because you see business lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that that lawyer understands intellectual property. And why that is so important for photographers when you're getting your contracts drafted, think about this for a second. Every business has intellectual property. They have business names, they have logos, but the restaurant down the street is not selling intellectual property. They're selling tacos or steaks or whatever.
Right.
What are you guys selling? The end product is intellectual property, whether it's digital or printed. And so that's even more of a reason to use template forms that understands and contemplate intellectual property issues, have a lawyer that understands that, and have a contract that governs all of this, as well as all the other services stuff you need to educate your clients, protect yourselves, and prevent miscommunication. That's the big thing that I try to impress, is that contracts are really, they're there to protect you, but they're also there to prevent issues, because you're going to spend more time and money cleaning up messes later than investing in the contract on the front end.
Right. So, you know, I hear a lot from photographers whenever I talk with them about, like, you know, having a retainer fee and having a contract, and they'll be like, you know, the contract's its own thing, but how about a retainer fee versus a session fee? What are your feelings on, like, the verbiage with those things? Or, like, some people will call it like a creative fee. Like, is it legally more powerful to say a retainer fee, or doesn't it matter at all?
It relatively, I'm going to get hate mail on this, so we make sure you listen to the whole thing that I say. It relatively doesn't matter what you call it, so long as you have proper operative language. So proper language to define that term and how that money is going to be treated. So you'll see in groups, people say, oh, a deposit is automatically refundable, a retainer is not, and this and that. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily as simple as that. I mean, from a legal standpoint, and it's also going to vary depending upon state, so the jurisdiction that you're doing business is, but what is most important is you defining what that term means, and is it refundable or not? What does that money go to? Are you contributing it to a collection, or is it simply for the photographer's time and talent and reservation on the calendar? So it's really not as simple as picking between retainer, deposit, creative fee. My suggestion would be to think about, what do you think your clients are going to perceive it to be? And then make sure you have it drafted in there what you want it to actually define. Because if I'm a client and I see fee, I'm going to automatically probably think that I'm not going to get that back.
Right. So along those lines, when a wedding photographer, for instance, is paid in full before they do their wedding, and then something happens for whatever reason, and maybe like the client cancels the wedding or whatever reason, what if something happens to the photographer? I guess there's a lot of variables here, but primarily I'm thinking more about like prepayment plans, where like a client might prepay for services. Are there more perhaps legal concerns that would happen with that versus if they pay after their session is done and they see their images?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not necessarily directly to how you asked it, but more of think in the context of, if I end up prepaying my entire wedding or my entire boudoir session up front, and then something happens and we're not actually able to do it, I can't see a photographer being awarded 100% when they didn't shoot and they didn't deliver anything, right? So I'm not saying it's bad business to get paid up front. I think that is really important, but just understand that just because it's all prepaid up front, it's going to be rationed out based on how many services were provided. So that's often where the non-refundable retainer deposit type stuff comes in, and why you want to have a language that says this is earned at receipt for reserving like the wedding date or the boudoir session or that kind of stuff, because in reality, once you carve out that date, no one else can book it, right?
Right.
However, no court is probably going to allow you to keep 100% simply because you couldn't book someone else in that slot if they cancel last minute and you didn't do anything but book it on your calendar. Right. So that's why it's a portion of it. That's why your retainer, deposit, whatever, is not the full amount, but it still helps to protect you, and you have that language to attribute to that. So I share all that to say, I see a lot of times in groups in these prepayment stuff, which I do think prepayment is a great idea, getting it all done before the session and all of that, or at least 75 to 80, maybe 90% ahead of time, whatever you want to do for your business. And as long as your contract contemplates it and writes it out, but it's understand, even if you get 100% before, and you don't photograph the boudoir session, you don't deliver it, you go to court, you're not going to get to keep 100%. Simple as that.
For whatever reason. So whether the client cancels or you cancel, it doesn't matter?
Well, that depends on what's in the contract, and that's a really crappy lawyer answer for me to give, but it's going to depend do you have a specific cancellation policy in there that allow, you know, and this is most common in like wedding contracts. If you cancel 6 months out, 3 months out, 2 months out, they have it as a sliding scale, because obviously the closer you get to a wedding date, the less likely you are going to be able to book that date with somebody else.
Yeah. So that's really a hot topic in the industry right now. So I'm glad we kind of touched on that a little bit, because it's something that I know I've had concerns about in the past when I tried to do it before. You know, primarily, I would think a perfect scenario would be those prepayment money. That prepayment money would be put into like a escrow or something where it would be safe and you wouldn't have spent it, because, you know, but we all know that photographers aren't that strong sometimes at business. So, you know, that's my main concern whenever I'm teaching students, that if you are going to do this, it needs to go in a special place, like a pot or an account or something. So it's safe just in case, you know, you have to do something else with it. So what do you see the biggest problem that photographers face legally? Maybe the problem that we're not prepared for, maybe, you know, because you don't know what you don't know. Like, what do you see the biggest problem being that maybe we just don't know about?
I mean, I think we touched on the two major ones, is not having a good contract that covers you, making sure that it is, you know, make sure it's well-rounded for photography, much like the non-refundable retainer deposit conversation we just had, the prepayment of stuff, and then knowing the copyrights. Because oftentimes I'll see clients photography clients, so my clients, photographers will unknowingly give away the ownership to photographs. And if you want to in your business, that's fine. That's completely whatever you want to do. And that's pretty common in commercial-based photography, is to sell the copyright, to sell the ownership to the client. But I often see that photographers will crumble, even though they don't necessarily want to sell it, because a client says they want all the rights. And it's not because the photographer is necessarily afraid to push back on the client. They just aren't educated enough to know. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Let me say something here. I mentioned this earlier. I said, just because you're a lawyer doesn't mean you know intellectual property. If you guys have read TheLawTog, you probably know more about intellectual property than the majority of lawyers that I know that are not IP specialists, because it is a very specific area of law. Right. And so don't feel bad if you don't know any of this and you're like, oh my gosh, she's throwing around all these terms. Just scribble them down, go over to TheLawTog. You can use the search bar. We have the subject matters broken out. But I do see a lot of newer photographers unwittingly either give away. They sell the copyright to the client simply because the client says they want all the rights, when the client doesn't even know what all the rights means. I mean, that's the most classic example. I'm trying to think if there's any. I mean, the biggest ones are really what we touched on, not having a proper contract, because that's where majority of the issues come out of. Right.
So especially like in my genre that I shoot, sometimes there are clients that want to hire me that I just don't want to work with, right? For whatever reason. And, you know, it's not like a clothing store where someone will come in and then they buy something and then they leave. You're like working really closely with these people for sometimes an extended period. How protected are you if you find someone and you're just like, well, like because you get like those warning flags, right? You're like, you don't want to work with them. How protected are we as a small business saying, I don't want to work with you?
I mean, as long as you're choosing to not work with them for reasons that are not protected. Like if I'm like, you're giving me a weird vibe, I don't want to work with you. Well, that's not a protected class under the law. But if I'm like, I don't want to work with you because you're not white, or I don't want to work with you because you're gay or you're not gay or whatever, those are all protected classes. And so that is obviously illegal, to not discriminate. But if it's just simply, and I went straight for the jugular to lay all that out, because these are top questions that we get. But guess what? If it's just simply because you give me the skeevies because I don't want to work with you, that's not a protected class. You should be okay. That being said, that's from a legal standpoint. You have to understand, we also need to just dissect this of when is it you're deciding you don't want to do business with this person? Is it before they sign the contract, or is it after they sign the contract? And what is the real reason? As long as it's not like a protected class that's illegal, you relatively can walk away if it's before you sign the contract. If it's after the contract, it's going to have to be something that's governed by the contract terms that allows you out, or something so egregious that you're not able to fulfill the purpose of the contract. For example, maybe you have a bride or a boudoir client that is so neurotic and they want you to answer the phone every time they call 500 times a day, and then they hurl insults at you and they're just awfully mean after you've already signed the contract, right? Well, being mean is not a protected class, so you can get rid of them if you want. But in that sort of situation, if it's not in your contract, like a cooperation clause or something, you could look at maybe something called frustration of purpose. I'm not able to fulfill, or this is impossible for me to fulfill what you want with this contract. Anyways, I share that as a quick example to say, depends on why you don't want to work with them, depends on when you decide you don't want to work with them, and what the reason is.
Right. So if they've signed the contract, I know it kind of depends on what the contract says, but say you find out they're neurotic, or say they walk into your studio and you think they're on drugs or something like that. Mm-hmm. If you're telling them to leave, or you're deciding not to work with them, and then you return their retainer fee just to be like, I'm done, mm-hmm. like we're good here, are you more protected if you return their money and you're just like...
Yeah, because you have to look at it from a standpoint, ask yourself, what would if the client was going to pursue me legally? So we're not even talking about word of mouth, any, harassment, anything like that by the client, just from a legal standpoint. If in that situation, I'd ask myself, what damages does this client have that they could pursue me for if I try to walk away? Like, what could they try to say? If you've refunded all the money, there's probably no damages, maybe hair and makeup they've expended, etc. But all of it's going to boil down to whatever the facts and the circumstances were. And I can't imagine, going into court, if you ever ended up there, which hopefully with contracts and everything else, we're trying to prevent having to go there, that you won't have a problem. But I think to answer your question, sometimes it's just easier to refund the money and walk away, even though I'll tell you what, there are times where I'm like, the principal thing, I'm going to fight this. But sometimes then you're the only one that loses, even though it's the principal. So you really have to pick your battles on it. And I'm not saying have a contract and then don't hold to it, or vice versa, but it's going to be a case by case. And there's also nuisance value. This is something that I work on a lot with my photographer clients, is what is the nuisance value to make this client go away? If it's a $250 non-refundable retainer, that's going to be a lot cheaper than even doing an initial meeting with a lawyer.
Right. So I have my hair and makeup artist come to my studio, and a lot of other people do as well. And, we have insurance. You recommend insurance, right? It's very
100%.
important. Yep. To have, is there a certain type of insurance that is better for photographers with studios?
So you're going to look at having regular property and equipment insurance, and then definitely your liability insurance. And very specifically with what you're talking about for like hair and makeup stuff, I highly recommend making sure that whatever liability insurance company that you use, the policy writes in employees and independent contractors, because your hair and makeup artist probably is not a W-2 employee for you. So I require all of my independent contractors that I work with like that with hair and makeup and stuff, I require them to carry their own liability insurance, but I don't ever want to rely on that. I want to make sure that my insurance is also going to cover.
Right. That's good to know. So I did have another question. A lot of like our beginning photographers, and even for me, even though I'm established and we have like all of our stuff, all of our ducks in a row, or whatever you say, some beginning photographers really get hung up on how to structure their business, like a sole proprietorship, which sounds like it's a good idea, but it's not, right? Or an SCorp or an LLC. What are some of the differences? Like, what's the best way to go?
So basically, sole proprietor means, you don't have to do anything. You act like you're in business and you're in business. You're automatically a sole proprietor or an SP. There's no division between yourself individually and your business. I never recommend this, ever. You'll see people in Facebook groups say, oh, be an SP, but have liability insurance. And I'm like, but insurances don't cover everything. So when we're looking at the entity, like the types you just mentioned, I'll come back to them in a second. We're looking at the entity. And we also want to think about other things for protection, contracts, and liability insurance. So these are going to be layers. You don't want to substitute one for the other. So for photographers, I primarily recommend the limited liability company or LLC. That's because I primarily work with a lot of single photographers, not your marital or relationship status, but like it's just you. Corporations sometimes can be overkill for smaller businesses just because it costs more. There's more administrative. You're going to need to have someone do an assessment for you. I just know, I don't even know the statistics, but we hardly ever recommend corporations unless two major things. You're going to have other owners in the business. And then also, do you anticipate on having investors down the line?
Right. So the first step then for someone that might be just starting their business and they want to make sure that it's legal, what would be the very first thing that someone should do if they are opening up their doors?
It's not even your entity yet. You're choosing a business name. And so if you're choosing one that's not your name, you want to make sure that you're not infringing on someone's trademark. And a business lawyer that doesn't have IP knowledge probably wouldn't have started there. But the reason I start there is so that you guys do the proper checks. Because if you go out, choose a business name, and then do your LLC, your insurance, your contract, your Facebook page, and all of that, and you're putting out a name that's infringing on someone's trademark, you're then liable. So always start with double checking the business name, making sure that it's available, not just in your state, but check nationwide here in the US. And then you can move into like your entity, your insurance, getting your contracts and that sort of stuff.
That's great. That's really helpful because I'm sure a lot of people get hung up on that. Like, where do I even start? What's the very first thing to do?
Yep.
So yeah, this has been so helpful and so much good stuff here. Thank you so much for your time. So if people want to find you, if they want to follow you, where can they find you at?
You guys can find me at TheLawTog.com. We also have a Facebook group of like 50,000 members, years worth of posts, really good active community that you can dig in, no stupid questions, ask away. People will help. And if you have any questions specifically, like about what we talked about here, feel free to submit through the Facebook page or the contact form, or we have a chat box on the website. Myself or the team will be more than happy to continue the conversation.
Perfect. This has been wonderful. And thank you guys so much for listening. If you're catching us on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. If you are listening to us on podcast, give us a 5-star review. It really does matter. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Rachel. It's been so good meeting you. And thanks for sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, of course. I look forward to talking to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you.